Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, 38 through 44. Listen for the word of the living God as we read these words. As Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance, say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth together about a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The living God still speaks today. Thanks be to God. I grew up with very little spiritual instruction around finances and economics. Perhaps you did as well. We didn't really talk about it. Well, we talked about tithing. We talked about giving to missions. We talked about supporting good causes. But beyond that, we never addressed any issue of note, anything of real significance. We mentioned not serving wealth in exchange for God. But it was as though once you had tithed, that was the end of it. Once you had tithed, well, nobody came out and said it, but the message was if God received your tithe, there was no way you could be serving money in place of God. That doesn't really track with Jesus' comments on money and wealth, does it? Economics was inseparably tied to morality for Jesus. Morality, justice, righteousness. The same for all the Hebrew prophets. They were all one and the same. Why would we pretend that Jesus took some different direction? Today's passage, this is hardly the first time or only time Jesus has discussed questions of economics. A couple of chapters back, we saw Jesus talking about the difficulty of the wealthy entering God's reign. He had lauded those who gave up material possessions and even family with the assurance of heavenly reward. He had cast merchants out of the temple. He has responded twice about paying taxes, once to Caesar and another a temple tax. He's responded to about renters of a vineyard paying the landholder faithfully according to their rental agreement. Now he points to those who gain wealth, power, and position by oppressing the vulnerable. He adds to that, responding to this widow who is bringing every little bit she had as being of much greater worth than the huge sums that the wealthy brought into the temple's treasury. none of that refers to tithing. None of it. The word tithe or tithing doesn't even show up in Mark's gospel. Jesus didn't preach against tithing. But when Jesus speaks of financial giving in Mark's gospel, he goes much further than tithing. He speaks of submitting everything to God. From what he says here, tithing would be maybe a bare minimum, the assumed baseline. It would fulfill the letter of one part of Torah, God's law, while ignoring so much more. That's something we never discussed when I was growing up. Instead, we placed an outsized importance on tithing to the exclusion of all of those other economic requirements contained in the Scriptures. The Hebrews were supposed to tithe from the produce of the land. They were to treat the land as though it belonged to God, and so they were just caretakers and returning to God a tenth as their rent for the land, shall we say. Then they were to offer the first fruits of their harvest, whether that was fruit in the summer or greens in the spring. The first fruits belonged to God. Then there were offerings of thanksgiving. Then there were specified offerings for celebrations, festivals, and life's milestones of various kinds. Likewise, they were to ensure that the poor and vulnerable were taken care of. They were to practice hospitality, offering food and shelter to outsiders, strangers, people passing through. They were to open their doors at Passover, inviting anyone to come in and join their feasting. If we ran the numbers, a tithe is nothing. The Sabbath already took a seventh out of their profit, didn't it? One day of the week they were to rest from work, but they were also supposed to rest their workers and their animals. Then they were to leave their fields untended 1 year out of 7. That's another 7, isn't it? 1/10 plus a 7th plus another 7th. That runs about 40%. And that only accounts for tithe and Sabbath. We find Jesus here watching the wealthy bring large sums of money into the temple treasury. He calls it showboating. They were using their offerings and tithes for purposes other than honoring, thanking, worshiping, and serving God. They were not concerning themselves with making sure that poverty could not exist in Israel. That was one of those commands in Torah, if you remember. Generosity was a measure of the nation's justice or righteousness, according to Torah. They were supposed to be so generous that poverty could not exist. Rather than rise to God's expectations of generosity, however, they were concerned with how giving made them appear to others. We all know appearances can be deceiving, don't we? Jesus also pointed out that much of the same flaunted wealth came from depriving the poor and unprotected, the vulnerable. Large donations were little more than self-incriminating evidence of their lack of generosity, of their injustice, their unrighteousness. We certainly didn't talk about that when I was growing up. Jesus points out this widow with mere pennies to her name. She quietly places these into the temple treasury. She called no attention to herself. She placed her all in God's hands. She trusted God to meet her needs, releasing what she had to care for others. That's what these gifts were supposed to be doing, right? As the widow in Zarephath that was feeding Elijah with her very last meal, she gave up all she had, trusting Yahweh with her very life, her present, her future. This is what that rich young ruler had refused to do, if you'll remember. This is what was missing for him to fully enter God's reign. Poor as she was, this widow had taken a step beyond what Jesus had required of his own disciples. She gave up everything in her control. In so doing, she became the standard by which all generosity is measured. The disciples had left homes. They had left family. They had left their trades or jobs to follow Jesus. But they still had places to which they could return. They still had standing to represent themselves in legal matters. They had autonomy over themselves, over their bodies. They were not wholly dependent upon the generosity of others. This widow lived an altogether different class of life. She was perpetually vulnerable to those willing to take advantage of the powerless. Her only hope was in God, and in those who would act toward her in justice or righteousness, those who would do the right thing in regard to her and her needs. We've talked before about how the term for righteousness in the Hebrew is the same term for justice. In Hebrew, they are not separate concepts. They are one concept in the Hebrew mind. To do right is to do what is just. To do justice is to act appropriately, correctly, in accordance with God's will. It's to do what is right, just, and good in regard to others. It means that another's needs impact how we respond to them. Another's needs impact how I live, how I use my resources, how I eat, and the rest of what I do as a steward of God's resources, a steward of God's creation. Faithful stewardship does not mean tithe and done. It's not tithe plus special offerings and done. It does not mean giving 40% to the church or even 90%. Faithful stewardship is not really giving anyway. It actually begins with understanding that we don't have anything to give. We don't have anything to retain. That's because nothing is ours. Even the breath in our very lungs belongs to God. The best we can do is actively place it all under God's direction, in accordance with God's will. The widow's mite here is not important because of its amount. It's not important simply for being all that she owned, all that she had. Its importance was in its expression of complete and utter dependence upon God, but also in that she was taking all that she was and controlled and letting it go. She was doing the thing that the rich young ruler could not accomplish amid his wealth, with all the ties he had to it. Her gift was a moral choice, a choice to live with an eye to the needs of others rather than her own aims, her own glaring needs. She was not technically following Jesus. She was, however, living according to the model that Jesus was teaching. She was putting all her resources at God's disposal with nothing to gain by it. Gain was not at all her focus. Her focus was surrender. Seemingly, it is often easier to surrender when we're more accustomed to owning less, to having less control. When we see the resources around us not as belonging to us, we've already made an initial step toward stewardship. This is not a critique of wealth itself. In a perfect world, we would all share a similar wealth and live in abundance. That's the picture we get in Genesis 2, isn't it? Man created to live in the garden with easy access to all our needs. That was God's plan from the beginning. The heart of the issue is how we wrangle the notion of ownership in contrast to stewardship. Stewardship is not about finances. It's recognizing that it all belongs to God, down to the pennies forgotten on the floor. All we have is to be used accordingly, under the direction of God's purposes. Our use of time, talents, energy, resources are all statements of our morality, of our relationship with God's purpose, of how we respond to the needs of people around us. We are not our own, but belong to Christ. Does our use of resources look like stewardship? Does it look like doing the right thing, the just thing, the moral thing, of caring for others on God's behalf?